What's going on, guys? It's Frito here for your Overwatch. With 3 Overwatch direct competitors coming out, hero shooter fans are spoiled this year. At Sony's State of Play, they just showcased Concord, a 5v5 character-driven first-person multiplayer shooter. There's been more and more leaks for Valve's Deadlock, which appears to be a third-person team-based hero shooter with MOBA and tower defense-style elements. Developed by IceFrog, the guy who made Dota originally, both when it was a use map settings mode in Warcraft 3, I remember those days, and into Dota 2 for Valve. Then the third one is Marvel Rivals, which just had an alpha and will have a beta in July. This one looks the closest to Overwatch 1, with distinct hero identities, a lot of similar mechanics, horrible imbalancing, and yes, 6v6. You guys have been asking me what I think about these competitor games, and I want to go through each one and then make a bigger conclusion on what it means for Overwatch. Most importantly, I think competition is good for everybody, because I truly believe no one will ever agree on the direction of any one of these games. I think it's better when they each pick their own lane and just exist in them, rather than trying to be the one game for every kind of community. And who knows in the end which one will win in the hero shooter arms race. First up, let's look at Concord, a game that looks like if Guardians of the Galaxy was a hero shooter. With this trailer, I'm pretty optimistic for Sony's ability to hit story beats, something that Overwatch has just dropped the ball on most of its life. Sony, on the other hand, we know has been very strong with storytelling for many years now. So while the character identities is a bit rote, it's kind of regurgitated Avengers humor for my tastes. It's reliable, relatable, it works. I think familiar enough to be identifiable compared to the other heroes that exist, with either the expectations of what their lore and fantasy is or just their personalities. Nothing breaking out of the mold from what I can tell, but a reliable base hit, let's say. Whereas a game that I think this actually could be compared to its own peril, is Lawbreakers. When we start looking at the gameplay, it's kind of a mix between Destiny or Apex, and the only game that I think has gone this far with the individuality of the hero kits is Lawbreakers, whose characters were kind of cringy and put people off, I think, as well as the gameplay being just a bit too all over the place. But it had an extreme loss of interest for several reasons, but I think Concord is the right mix. I've always felt that Destiny was a game that just didn't really utilize its RPG components enough. It sort of felt like Halo plus one ability for me, which of course, as an Overwatch fan, that might make sense because Overwatch abilities are so wild and so divergent oftentimes from the base standard shooter kit that it alienates people in the other direction, whereas I think Concord looks like a kind of a mix. Gunplay similar to Apex and Destiny, and just like Blizzard, the developers themselves in the trailer said they were inspired by fighting and strategy games. So the character matchups and mismatches are going to be important to this game. It's asymmetrical on purpose. Concord looks to me to be less of an Overwatch 1 competitor and more of an Overwatch 2 competitor, where I think Overwatch 1 was stronger in some of the MOBA elements to build a bigger team comp with less FPS in it. 2 is more similar to Concord, where there's a lot of harsh asymmetrical matchups, and while it looks like they have a relatively small roster, with how unique each kit is, there's just no way that there's going to be balance in this game, and especially if there's counterpicking, it is going to have to learn some lessons from Overwatch 2 to not make the entire player base go crazy about it. The next game we're going to look at is called Deadlock. This has come through with a series of leaks. It's currently in closed beta, and it's a hero shooter, but in the style of Dota. So there's going to be lanes that you farm mobs against and items, so this is the most try-hardy, complicated version of all of these games, with the harshest skill ceiling and intense knowledge that you're going to have to amass in order to just function as a player. This looks to be the most hardcore hero shooter of them all. And we might even lean a little bit more towards MOBA elements, not just for the base gameplay format, but because the shooter elements of the game are a little closer to the third-person shooting of Marvel Rivals and less of the FPS mindset of either Overwatch 2 or Concord. I think this makes a bit of a benefit for balancing, because then you can think of balancing and designing the characters more for their abilities and movement as opposed to their FPS mechanics, which is yet another really complex tuning knob that Overwatch struggles with, because they have to try to figure out how to make new, interesting weaponry that fits uniquely for each FPS kit, while also having these other abilities, and it makes for very lopsided designs, which tend to break the game. Whereas when everybody's shooting from the same point of view, I don't think you have to worry so much about how your gun animation looks or feels and the impact of pulling the trigger like a shooter game does. More characters can kinda shoot the same with their main attacks, or maybe just not even have ranged attacks, it depends. I would say Deadlock looks like the one that has the most potential to self-destruct or to blow up among a very dedicated hardcore community. Valve is the type of company that strikes out hard with their games, as well as their ideas. Most of the Steam products that they come out with are really boom or bust. Recently, they came out with the Steam Deck, which I love, which is like an innovative design that everybody universally praises. But before that, they had the Steam Controller, which a lot of people hated. And not so long ago, Valve attempted to do a Dota spin-off game called Artifact, and it bombed out completely. It also had lane-based combat, but was just a bit too complicated. Yet they're also known for pioneering gaming in a lot of ways and are famous for one of the greatest games of all time, Half-Life 2. Point is, Valve likes to go big or go home. But I can tell you this, I know Lord Gaben loves Dota. I know this because I played Counter-Strike for years, and that was the Valve game they don't really care about as much. Dota got all of the goodies. Way more attention, love, and care than their other games, though they did eventually make Counter-Strike 2. We know which one of the children is Gabe's favorite. Because of that, I think Valve is going to put their full force behind this, but so far I think it's got some gimmicky ideas. You got zip lines to cross the map, which probably feel nice to do in theory, but like, do we really want to be shooting mobs? I remember when Titanfall came out, and that was pretty controversial to have mob-based characters in a shooter game. We'll see. I think this is the type of game that's going to nail the complexity and the skill ceiling that a lot of players are looking for, but I think it lacks some of that immediate familiar responsiveness of other shooter games. So especially compared to Concord or Overwatch 2, I think the gameplay feel of those games will go farther. And last but certainly not least is Marvel Rivals, which looks to be basically the closest thing to Overwatch 1 we might ever get. It's got 6 players per team, distinct roles, but open queue, so you can kind of pick whatever you want, and very clear imbalances. There was massive chasms between the performance of some of the characters, and there is a new team-up mechanic, which makes 2 heroes put together to make into some big synergy. And I can tell you this right now for free, none of this will ever be balanced. But a lot of Overwatch creators went through to play it and said that the game is fun, and we of course might fall in love with the character identity, particularly if you already were a Marvel fan. When I try to explain to people what Overwatch is as a game, if they're not familiar, I typically say sort of like if the Avengers were fighting each other in a shooter game. Well, that's like literally what Marvel Rivals is. I'm pretty excited for this one to come out, not because I am excited to play it, but I think there's a lot of Overwatch fans will be getting what they're looking for with this game, and I really hope that Marvel Rivals leans into those things rather than just carbon copying Overwatch and these other games that are trying to be too balanced. OpenQ Overwatch 1 had the opportunity to be very free-flowing, expressive, crazy, without the expectations of balance or a reliable team comp. Just do the thing you want and express yourself. Us competitive players in Overwatch 1 may have mocked that idea a little bit, like you want to cosplay as your favorite character and ruin our competitive experience while you force your pick into an unfavorable matchup, as well as a long list of issues we already know Marvel Rivals is likely to be subjected to. I distinctly remember how forgiving all the community was in Overwatch 1 for its bad balancing at the start of the game. People forget that we started off with 4 roles and the characters were super uneven. Nowadays, we're spoiled to live in a world where they're really trying to rework every hero to be self-sufficient in some way. Back then, Symmetra was a support, Hanzo couldn't barely move, Junkrat hurt himself with his own mines. It's like the characters were really sharp and only did one thing. And sometimes your character just sucked. Marvel Rivals very clearly suffers from this as well, but it also has other issues for me. The visual clutter and chaos is really hard to unsee. It doesn't have role lock, which I think is good for those who want to commit to it. And I hope Marvel Rivals leans more away from the competitive side of the game to service those that want the free-flowing nature of more casual gameplay. I don't really get the point of the map design either. Like, there's destructible environments because in theory the heroes are going to smash into them and explode and make the bridge fall down or the wall fall over or whatever. But for me, this is just a big gimmick, and I actually think they should go one step further, almost down like the Battlefield 3 and 4 route, where the map would transform after the destruction and it was kind of baked into the map with no fair competitive concepts whatsoever, because as it stands now, it's just kind of like an extra visual. But if they're going to make a more casual for fun game, like, I want to see it transform the map, because otherwise the map is just sort of like an open objective and a few paths to it, everyone just fighting in a big circle, whereas I would prefer shooter shooter gameplay where you have to go gain positions of advantage. They barely exist in Marvel Rivals, honestly, because a lot of the characters are so free-flowing anyway. It's not really an FPS game after all. It's more of a third-person hero shooter. So overall, 3 games coming out to compete with Overwatch. What do I think? I think the variety is going to make all of them stronger, and a few of them are going to fall off hard. Going in the order that we covered them, Concord is the one that I would be most attuned to liking personally, because I like direct shooter combat, asymmetric matchups. I liked the concepts from Lawbreakers, but I think they've learned from that game's failure. The characters are much more relatable and not cringeworthy like that game, and hopefully they can learn from some of the mistakes from Overwatch and make a better version of Overwatch 2. That's the possibility I see with that one. Also, I think it has the potential to have the best story out of all of these if they decide to commit to it, because Sony has shown they can do that better than almost anybody in the gaming industry nowadays. Deadlock. I actually think this one is probably going to die on the vine, because at the moment I can't really see it having that immediate fun factor to it. Complexity and depth isn't enough to like get people flocking to play your game. Maybe it might even have the highest high-end competitive environment, and I look forward to maybe some more actual dedicated MOBA elements being finally added to some of these hero shooters, because it solves a lot of issues that I think players have, where if you don't have MOBA leveling up or items to gain an advantage, it's really hard to outmatch a disadvantaged matchup. Whereas in a MOBA game, even if you're at a disadvantage, if you play well in the early game, you build up an RPG stats advantage or get an item that allows you to have a new ability, let's say, and then all of a sudden you get peaks of power as the game goes on. So Deadlock has like the highest potential, but I think the hardest barrier of entry, which I think is a similar comparison to Dota after all, which is a die-hard MOBA game where the passion for that game is like unreal, but it appeals to a bit of a smaller, more hardcore demographic. While that looks like a risk, it's actually a benefit, because with so many of these games coming out to compete with one another, it's pretty tough that you're going to expect to win the top prize and be the best of all of them. What you don't want is to look like you're an easy replica of another one. Deadlock has the distinct advantage, if they nail it, to really service that hardcore audience that wants exactly what it's giving that no other game comes close to. Then third, on Marvel Rivals, this is the one I think most clearly is going to attack those that really miss the MOBA brawly aspects of Overwatch 1, which have kind of been lost when it's been dedicated to be more of a shooter in the sequel. I'm most optimistic about this one's performance to succeed down a separate lane that Overwatch is no longer looking to occupy, so that those players that want specifically that can leave for a while maybe and even come back to Overwatch, realizing that the grass isn't always greener when it comes to the chaos and freedom of expression to have really imbalanced characters. Like, once you get a lot of these things you think you're asking for, it's pretty easy after a while to see its downsides, just like we did with the 6 years we had Overwatch 1, 3 of which were in the open queue 6v6 format, which in the open queue format, the developers have to make a really tough decision that high-level gameplay is going to revolve around heroes that work together well as a team, whether that's supports or tanks, being crucial to the gameplay. But often those characters aren't as popular in the mainstream player base. So where do you balance the mat? Do you give them stats to function in an unorganized environment, or do you hamper their abilities at the higher tiers and then make them even less popular in the unorganized environment? I think our community in Overwatch has really forgotten that a character like Brigitte was both one of the most intense, overpowered characters in the history of all of gaming, and our community kind of didn't really play them. Not well anyway. Like, if you dedicated to learning Brig, you would skyrocket through the ranks, but most players played in a more casual mindset back then, or they just wanted to play Genji or whatever else they liked to play. So the competitive high-end Brig apocalypse that was forthcoming was kind of ignored by the majority of the player base, because they could choose to ignore it and not engage with the competitive elements of the game, which is having a few tanks and a few supports on your team. No one had to do that. But at the same time, you felt like you couldn't function as a competitive player if you didn't have those players on your team. So someone had to flex or fill, or the game experience was incredibly uneven. Just like we said in the 6v6 video, no solutions, only trade-offs. Those are the 3 major competitors coming down the line for Overwatch 2. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Which one of these 3 do you think has the opportunity to take Overwatch out? No more time for Overwatch to rest on their laurels and be complacent. The wolves are at the door. Blizzard better choose their next year of development very carefully, because it could be crucial to have a competing fighting chance up against these new and shiny toys right around the corner. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos come out. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time.